My name is Rheal Lafreniere. That's how you say it in English. It actually sounds so much better in French. Rheal Lafreniere. When I was talking to Renata about this presentation, I think she was asking me, like, could you talk a little bit about, beekeeping and provincial apiculturists, for the changes that have occurred. And I think she was asking me because I'm one of the more senior provincial apiculturists out there, or old. So I took that as a challenge. So I wanted to take a look at our provincial program, but I think it probably mimics a lot of other programs. There's been a significant amount of change that has gone on in beekeeping, and that has definitely correlated to changes at the provincial level as well too. So when I titled my talk, Looking Back and Planning Forward, it really kind of encompasses that in order to really make plans for the future, you have to kind of look where you came from. So when I was doing that, I was kind of trying to figure out what are the major roles and responsibilities of provincial programs, especially in the early days. So the primary purpose of these positions was to help promote beekeeping and honey production. And this is in the very early days of these provincial appointments. And I was also there to help the beekeeping community to get organized. And as time went on, the demands from beekeepers kept on pushing the government to invest with them to develop new tools to protect their investment. So we needed to have more understanding of diseases and knowing who had bees and how vulnerable beekeepers were because of diseases. But you can't keep bees in a fenced area. They travel. So we needed to have a registry of beekeepers. We needed to also collect stats on beekeeping. The inspection and regulatory was really key points for beekeeping advancement. And it's probably one of the biggest jobs in the Provincial Apiculture Office now. We were there to promote best management practices. We're part of the education, extension, and a lot of times links to research as well too. And really, the Provincial Apiculturist position is kind of this liaison. We almost got one foot in the industry and we got one foot in government. We know where we get our money from, and it's from our clients, but it comes through the government. So we kind of work both sides of it. We're there to help communicate to the government, as well as work very closely with universities. So we understand that this is a role where we are there to help the industry as best as we can, but we will have to play a kind of a government role when need be. So when we look at the beginning of these provincial apiculturist appointments, in 1916 in Manitoba, that was our first appointment, was Muckle. But really, in the 1920s, when disease really started to take off, that's when these programs became very important. And the registry of beekeepers and inspecting colonies for disease really came about. But these people were also key in helping to develop the necessary legislation to help market honey, to organize beekeeper associations, and also to regulate diseases. So the pioneers of helping to develop all that were these really early provincial apiarists. For the remainder of this talk, I'm really going to concentrate on the last 40 years of beekeeping, kind of in the 1980s and right till today. And this is kind of a time where we went through a major change in beekeeping, and that role of regulatory became really important. And I'm going to be talking mainly about these individuals: Don Dixon, Barry Fingler, myself, and David Osterman. For those of you that are around during the 1980s, it was a time where it was very bold, flashy, neon was all over. It was very corporate at that time too, and there was lots of TV shows that really epitomized the 1980s, and I just remember Miami Vice. Like, my childhood was in the 70s, but I really grew up in the 1980s. And, Crockett and Tubbs were these two really well-dressed detectives, chasing bad guys and busting drug dealers and really trying to clean up the streets. And this was also the time where we were going through a major change in beekeeping, and we had our dynamic duo. We had Don Dixon and Barry Fingler, and their vice was mites. The early 80s was the good times. The end of the 80s, when mites start becoming a problem, it really changed beekeeping completely. So they had a really monumental task in front of them. The fortune at that time was that the beekeeping industry, as well as government, when they were challenged with this, they worked together to have the necessary resources to deal with this. So we had 2 full-time provincial aparists. Although Barry Fingler did do a lot of leaf cutting bee stuff, more than 70% of his time was spent on honeybees, and especially when the mites came on board. We had a full-time administrative person dedicated to the apiculture program. We had an inspection crew of 6 to 8 seasonal inspectors, and again, in the early 80s, their primary responsibility was one disease, American foul brood. So we had the necessary resources to stay on top of stuff. They also used to hire summer students. I started working for them in the late 1980s. So we always had 1 or 2 summer students that would be bee inspectors, but then at the end of the season of bee inspection, they would go on and do other projects. When the mites came on board, we were able to hire 2 to 3 more students that were dedicated to just dealing with the mite situation. They were located in Cam Jay's lab at the University of Manitoba, and they dissected bees looking for tracheal mites. So we were able to get the necessary resources to deal with the issue. At that same time, we were still inspecting for American foul brood, and the average over that decade was still where we were looking at 14% of the total registered hives in the province. And then back in the early 1980s, that was around 120,000 colonies. I know in Alberta you guys had more than that, but 120,000 colonies in Manitoba is a lot of colonies. That changed substantially when Varroa came on board, and a lot of beekeepers left the industry. When I look at the 1990s, the next decade, it was quite different. It was nowhere near as flashy. It was more comfort. You were looking for comfort all over. And one of the comforting programs was Cheers. You had this group of people that were all likable, and everything was just, there was no drama, or very little drama. And you were looking for those creature comforts all the time. Although there were some substantial changes during that time when Diane Chambers left Cheers. How was Cheers going to survive? But when Rebecca Howe came in, it kept on going. Rebecca was definitely more edgy. So we knew that as we went into the 1990s, the end of the 1990s were certainly more edgy than the early 1990s. Well, when we look at our cast and crew at Manitoba Agriculture, we also had some changes. Unfortunately, we had to cheers goodbye to Barry Fingler when he passed away in 1995. And then we also had to introduce a new character, this bald-faced 14-year-old, I think. I got started at that time, and we got to kind of keep the status quo as much as possible. The 1990s were fairly steady. Change wasn't nowhere near as dramatic as that late 1980s. The investment, industry fully supported as well as government supported, maintaining 2 provincial apiculturist positions. We still had a full-time administrative support, but as time went on, we had to share that person. We had to share their time with crop diagnostics. So we didn't quite have all the same resources, but these changes were much more gradual. We had to downsize our inspection because we were forced now that they weren't cutting our budgets, but they were asking us to do more with less. So we had the same budget, so we had to kind of adjust to that. We were still able to hire summer students. We also were able to find a technician that worked casually, which was really great. And we kind of did a lot of investment in the lab instead of doing a lot of field research, where beekeepers can now not only get information about their AFB disease threat, but they could also get information about honeybee tracheal mite, when we were kind of looking for honeybee tracheal mite, we were also doing Varroa analysis at that time. Started off with sticky borers, but then moved over to more efficient ways of doing it. But since we had bee samples coming in, wanted to look for nosema as well too. So we start to really develop our diagnostics at that time. And again, still able to do that within the existing budget. We did do a little less American foul brood inspection. It's just because we were spending a lot more time looking at other diseases. But we wanted to maintain above that 5%. We wanted to still look at 5% of those colonies in the province to make sure that the disease would be caught really early. Then we went into the 2000s, and this was dramatic change from the 1990s. Everything was much more intense. Lots and lots of drama. And the TV shows represented that drama as well too. We had TV shows like Walking Dead that got started at that time. We had a lot of these reality TV shows where people would be voted off. And we had Sons of Anarchy, which I really enjoyed as well too. But these were really dramatic TV shows. We got to see people that were part of the show be killed off, in the very next episode. So that expectation started to happen. And in Manitoba Agriculture, it never was that dramatic. There was no killing off of anybody, but we did see a change of the guard. We did see Don Dixon move off. He was still within Manitoba Agriculture, but he moved up higher into the organization as a director of the crops branch. And I moved into his position, so I was wearing the lead hat. But we were still at a time where we were able to convince, powers that be, that we needed 2 positions. So we hired David Osterman in mid-1990s. Again, 2 full positions, but we were starting to get squeezed a lot more. And this would be the time that, we were really being forced to do more with less. We had to share administrative support. Not only were we sharing with crop diagnostics, that person was also in charge of pesticide licensing. So we didn't get a lot more of our time. So we were having to become more self-sufficient as specialists. We were also forced at that time where they were not going to increase the budget and costs were all going up. And we were able to negotiate with the industry where they helped to cost share the inspection program. And although 70% was government funds, they were coming up with about 30% of the funds to run the inspection program. We were doing it through the Manitoba Beekeepers Association, so we weren't collecting it off individual beekeepers, but we were offering diagnostics where we would not do it for free. There would be a small nominal cost, and all that money went back to the beekeepers to represent their share of the program. Again, we were able to maintain the inspection program with a good crew of inspectors, and we were able to maintain that lab tech person and really, again, focus on our diagnostic abilities. During this time, we were seeing resistance, so we needed to test for AF or antibiotic resistance in American foul brood or diseases, and we were also dealing with Varroa resistance as well too. So we had to have that lab capability to do that. In the early 2000s, we were still offering honeybee tracheal mite analysis, but it was just too costly to do that, so we had to cut that out. We were still doing nosema, and then good old small hive beetle showed up occasionally. Wasn't establishing, but we had to develop a way of keeping an eye on small hive beetle. We were able to maintain the AFB inspection above that 5%, which was our target, so we were still feeling good about ourselves. We were becoming very, very efficient, but we knew we were stretching ourselves thin. Then the 2010 came. And if we thought the intensity in the 2000s was there, the drama was even greater in 2010. We were dealing with attrition. Any job that became vacant was not going to be filled. That was also reflected in the TV that we watched at that time too. And we got to expect people to die in TV shows. And Game of Thrones was certainly one of those. We also find the 2010s very polarizing. You had to choose one side or the other. Were you, House Stark or were you House Targaryen? You were forced to make kind of more decisions. And in Manitoba Agriculture, we kind of had the same thing where we were now being forced. We were having attrition. Our secretary or admin person quit or retired, lost our admin support. Our casual technician wanted to retire as well too, lost that. We also lost our budget for our inspection program for a short period of time. And unfortunately, David Oshman at the end of 2019 moved on as well too. So we were down to one provincial apiarist. Game over was starting to be looking like it was inevitable, but we weren't quite ready to give up yet. So game was not quite over. As I mentioned, we went down to one provincial apiarist. We had no admin support. I had to beg and borrow to put out surveys or send out our recommendations, just to stuff envelopes. I used to bring that stuff home and watch TV and stuff envelopes. That's how desperate we got during this time. As I mentioned, we lost our inspection budget in 2013. At the end of 2012, we were given a hypothetical. What would happen if you didn't have an inspection budget? And 2 months later, we did not have an inspection budget. So we basically lost the program at that time. And worse, it wasn't only a money issue. Government was downsizing. So they took away our ability to hire. Like we were assigned a certain, it's called a FTE, full-time equivalent. They took our full-time equivalent. So we didn't have any ability to hire inspectors. So we lost our diagnostic capabilities. So we had to redirect everything to the National Bee Diagnostic Center. Luckily, they were up and running and we could send our beekeepers somewhere. This was certainly the time where we talked about doing more with less. This was a fait accompli. You had to do less with less. So even our AFB inspection, we could not maintain that level of AFB inspection, and we fell below our beloved target of 5%. Starting to question whether we were going to be able to kind of catch things early, and then was this program even worth it anymore if you weren't going to be able to catch things early? Luckily at this time, industry really supported the programs, and we had a lot of support from industry, meeting with ministers and all this, and we were able to kind of develop a way around not being able to hire inspectors. So we had to look at other models, and the third-party inspection program was what we had to look at. So these were people that we contracted out. They weren't government employees. They were still appointed under our act and given the powers of inspectors, but they were hired, as a contract. So we were able to recover that, and we were able to enter into a 3-year contract and get some inspections again. So we targeted around 4,000 colonies, which kind of got us around that 5% when we were around 80, 85,000 colonies. But this is the time when the industry was growing. And by the end of that contract, we weren't anywhere near 5% again. So we had to look at how we were going to deal with that. And luckily, we were able to get into a new contract at the end of the first contract. So in 2019, we entered into another 2-year contract. And with the support of the Beekeeper Association, they pushed hard to have more money available to do that inspection. And we were able to increase the amount of inspection done so that we were getting close to that at 5% again. So industry really came up and helped this salvage our program. Also at this time was the Antimicrobial Resistance Initiative. And although that comes with a kind of a lot of baggage, there was a lot of concern about that initiative. Antibiotic availability was going to be restricted. The one thing it did allow us is that we were now being treated a lot more like animals than we ever had been. Not us, provincial apiarists, but our bees were more recognized as animals. And that allowed us, as well as the industry, to go back to government and say, you offer diagnostic services to all these other livestock. Why aren't you offering that to honeybees? So we were able to work with the Manitoba Agriculture Veterinary Services labs and develop a program with the assistance of the National Bee Diagnostic Center and the University of Manitoba. The National Bee Diagnostic Center helped us by giving us some of the protocols they do. They help put on training events for the staff at the veterinary services. And we're really able to kind of start our bee diagnostic services back in Manitoba and not rely on shipping all of the samples outside the province. We were actually able to increase the amount of diagnostics we offered as well too. We were never able to do viruses, but these vet diagnosticians had all the skills there to do viruses as well too, so we added some viruses to that. But we definitely got, you know, the AFB and the Nosema testing back. But we also didn't want to go in competition with the National Bee Diagnostic Center as well too. So we have some kind of working agreement where we're not going to outprice them. We're setting the price exactly the same as what the National Bee Diagnostic Center. So if you want a full complement of diagnostics, you could still bring it to vet services. If they can't do that diagnostics, they will package it up for the beekeeper and send it off to NBDC at no extra cost to the beekeeper other than whatever extra analysis that they've asked for. So we definitely had some resurgence of services in that late part of the 2010s. But what we're going to do in the 2020s, I don't really know. I don't know whose face is going to be on there. We just came through a time of extreme vulnerability. I felt a lot like Baby Yoda. We're pretty thin at this point. If they were still working off attrition, we're at attrition of 1. But knowing that we had the backing of the beekeeper, and I call it the force of the beekeeping community, and a kick-ass lightsaber, I have a lot of, I guess, optimism for the industry and the inspection program into the future, as long as we, again, fully support what we're doing and adjust wherever we need to adjust. And I don't know if that's much earlier than I got 1 minute for questions if people have any questions.